Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to be talking about moral injury. Well, in this video, in the next video I'm doing two videos. This one I'm going to explain the problem, so what's gone wrong, and in the next video I'm going to explain how to fix it. So we're talking about moral injury. So what is moral injury? Well, the best definition that I found is something along the lines of having an experience that violates your most deeply held moral beliefs. And so if you witness someone doing something that you feel is very immoral, or if you experience someone doing something very immoral, or sometimes it's described as an act of omission, so not doing something that you should have done. So if you think about like a Vietnam veteran that maybe saw his platoon mates raping a woman and he didn't say anything, and so then that would be a form of moral injury. And it can also occur in the form of betrayal. Generally, moral injury has been talked about as something that's separate from PTSD, although it is acknowledged that sometimes it overlaps with PTSD. But my sense of it is that moral injury is one of the core problems of post-traumatic suffering disorder, as I like to call it. And when I was at when I went to the psychedelic conference, the MAPS conference in Denver back in June, and I was talking to some of the veterans groups there, and I mentioned that I was working on a new model for PTSD that identified the core problems. I think of about half dozen people I talked to, I think every single one of them asked me if it included moral injury. And so I don't think I'm alone in thinking that this is one of the core problems of PTSD. And the way that I came to understand this was actually, and I've told the story in other videos, but I like the story, so I'll tell it again. It was kind of early on in my journey, and I was realizing that one of my sources of suffering was that I just really didn't trust reality. It's like I was just waiting for something bad to happen. I think it's commonly referred to as a sense of impending doom. And I actually have a friend of mine who, after a particularly good run of luck, and I mentioned that to him, hey, things are going your way, and he made the comment, yeah, I'm just waiting for the freight train to fall out of the sky. And so it's that kind of sense of like something bad is right around the corner. And if something bad is right around the corner, I realized that it's very hard for me to feel optimistic, to feel happy, to feel really positive about life itself. And one night I was reading Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, and I came across this passage, and it's like a light bulb went on, and I was like, holy shit, like this is one of the more I thought about it, the more I realized like this is one of the core problems that I'm dealing with. Because, and I simplify those relationships to the relationship that you have with yourself, the relationship that you have with people/humanity, because it exists at different levels, and then the relationship that you have with reality/God, because even if you're an atheist, you still have a relationship with reality. And if you believe in God, then you could or do, I don't know, it depends, I guess, how you think about it, but attribute, whatever's gone wrong or the state of the world or whatever to God, right? And so that's how I've come to think of it as three relationships. And I really like the idea of conceptualizing it as three relationships because, like I keep saying, the way that you conceptualize a problem determines how you go about solving the problem. And so by conceptualizing them as relationships, we're looking at basically repairing the relationships, right? That's what we need to do to heal, because when you experience moral injury, those relationships are damaged. And they're damaged even in ways that might not be immediately obvious, because you would think, well, if I'm a victim of trauma, if someone did something bad to me, why would I feel bad about myself? And it's like, well, it depends, it varies, right? Because like victims of child abuse often feel like they deserved it, or maybe they were willing participant. They feel like they were willing participants, or they feel like it's a reflection of their value, of like their value as a person. And so that's one way. Victims of sexual assault often have feelings of shame and guilt afterwards for a variety of reasons. Soldiers that go to combat kind of interact with that darker side of themselves, their shadow, and they see themselves, enjoying killing other human beings. In this case, I'm referring to enemy combatants. But also, if you accidentally kill a civilian in war, that's going to also be a moral injury, right? And you don't necessarily have to, I'm assuming you didn't enjoy it. That's the assumption anyways I'm going to make. But even if it was an accident, you're still going to feel guilty about it. And there's a TED Talk that I'll link in the description by a Vietnam veteran who talks about moral injury and his moral injury. And he felt that the Vietnam War was immoral and wrong. And he actually filed for conscientious objector status, but still ended up being drafted and ended up as a medic in, I think he said, the 101st Airborne. And so, and he talks about how, he made a trip back to Vietnam with some of his comrades, and talks about an experience he had where he met a older Vietnamese woman who had lost a brother during the war. And she said basically that it's not your fault that, you know, you came here and you did those things. You were just doing what you were told. You were doing your job as a soldier. It's not something that you need to feel bad about. And he talks about how that was a very healing experience for him, and it's because he was able to repair that relationship with self. Now, the relationship with people, that one's a little more obvious, right? Because if you see someone doing something bad, or someone does something bad to you, or you do something that you feel is bad, or don't do something that you feel like you should have done, then that's a reflection on what people are like, right? And I actually remember when I think I was about 8, maybe 9, I remember, and I didn't remember this until fairly recently, but drawing pictures of like an army of children defeating all of the adults and taking over, because I thought the way I conceptualized it was that all adults were bad. And I kind of had forgotten that I ever drew those pictures, or that I even really thought that way. But that was at a point in my life where I was forming my very most, your core beliefs, right? And so if you experience things as a child when you're still trying to make sense of like, well, what is life? What are humans? What are we doing here, right? Because you think about like a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old, like you're still really just trying to figure out what is existence, really? Like, what is this reality about at that point, right? And if you are hit with all kinds of trauma, then this feels like it's some kind of gross, nasty game that you're playing, right? Maybe not game, but you're in some kind of a bad reality, right? And reality is a bad place, and that's where that last relationship with reality or God, because if it's like, what kind of God would allow that to happen, or this to happen, or whatever, right? And so when you start going down that kind of train of thought of like, well, if there was a just God, or if this was a good reality, then those things wouldn't happen. That's kind of where that relationship with reality comes into play. And when I use the word relationships, like we have relationships with everything, right? You have a relationship with your job, with your car, with where you live, with all kinds of things, right? And a relationship is just the way two things interact with each other. But in this case, it's the way that you think and feel and perceive yourself and people and the world. And what happens is, because all of those relationships are damaged, the way it's experienced is feelings of detachment, of estrangement. There's 3 criteria in the DSM. I'll throw them up on the screen. Not only do I think that these are a pretty good description of depression and what depression feels like, but these are also, I think, these are the symptoms of moral injury. Depression is a symptom of moral injury, as far as I can tell. Now, there are other reasons why a person would be depressed, and there are other reasons why a person that's experiencing PTSD would be depressed. I mean, if you have an overactive nervous system, you're not sleeping, you're emotionally numbed out, you're dealing with nightmares or flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, you're carrying around a lot of pain and anger and all kinds of other negative emotions, like you have other reasons to be depressed. And also, because this leads to feelings of detachment and estrangement, people that have experienced severe moral injury end up being very isolated. And so now you add on top of that loneliness, not having meaningful relationships, your career will suffer. Basically, your whole life just kind of ends up being shitty, And so those are all valid reasons to feel depressed, right? And so, someone with moral injury, it's not just going to be the moral injury probably. There's probably going to be other sources of depression. And so I'm going to make another video about depression, about external and internal sources of depression, how I overcame my depression. And so the way this is felt is really, it's a lived experience. It's a lot about how it feels, and I'm going to use the word mood to kind of try to describe how it ends up being, like manifesting inside of a person's personality and inside of their lived experience. And I know moods are generally thought of as like more short-term things, right? Like they last like a day or something, right? Well, this is like stretched out across like the person's life. But if you think about like, well, what characterizes a bad mood? And it's like, well, moral injury is going to make you feel a lot of shame and guilt. And it's going to make you feel shame and guilt because of that relationship with self, right? If you think of yourself as a bad, shitty person, you're going to feel shameful and guilty. And then anger is a big one, because a lot of reasons to be angry, like especially if something was done to you, right? Or even just witnessing something existing in the world can make you angry. Like recently what happened in Israel with the terrorist attacks by Hamas, like that probably outraged a lot of people, and rightfully so, right? And so anger is a big one. Resentment is another big one. Fear, definitely fear. And that kind of, now we're starting to come in more like talking about the relationship that we have with people and the relationship that we have with reality. But fear ends up being a very large part of how you experience life, because you're always kind of waiting for something bad to happen. So you're always looking out for, what do I need to do to avoid that bad thing happening? And that's really fear, right? And then another big one is cynicism, which is the opposite of, it's like being distrustful. It's like you don't believe that good things are happening. You don't trust in people. You don't trust in reality. And so you end up being a very cynical person. And then indifference. And I also use the term nihilism kind of somewhat interchangeably with that, but sometimes nihilism is thought of as like a philosophy, but I'm not using it in that way. I'm using it as a feeling, right? Like a feeling of extreme indifference. Like I don't care, nothing really matters, fuck it, right? And all of those really end up drastically diminishing the way that we experience life. Not only the way we experience life, but when those feelings become a dominant part of your experience on a day-to-day basis, that basically ends up really affecting your personality. And so you can almost think of like a symptom of moral injury as basically being in a perpetual bad mood, characterized by indifference and anger, cynicism, and all those negative emotions and feelings that I just talked about, right? And I'll give you an example. You've all seen it, I guarantee, in at least a few different shows or movies or a book or something, but there's like an existing group of characters, and then a new character comes into the story, and the new character interacts with one of the older characters, and then it's kind of like a negative interaction, and they walk away or they exit the scene, and then the new character asks one of the other older characters, what's his problem? And it's usually one of two responses, right? Either, oh, he's just like that, or, oh, his brother just died, right? So there's either that's their personality or something just happened to them to put them in a bad mood, right? But in almost every case, I think what you'll find is that person that has that as part of their personality, that's just like, oh, that's just what they're like. If you go far enough back, you find some tragedy or trauma or something that kind of warped their personality into being kind of in that, that negative way, right? And so, how do we heal it? That's the real big question, right? And that's going to be the next video, what I'm going to talk about, but I'll talk about it a little bit here. And so basically the phrase that, it's an old phrase, I don't know where it comes from, but the phrase is to understand all is to forgive all. And that's really what we have to do. We have to forgive. We have to forgive ourselves to the degree that we need to, right? Because a lot of times your relationship with self is damaged. You didn't do anything wrong. There's no reason you need to forgive yourself. You need to realize that you don't need to forgive yourself, that you didn't do anything wrong, right? But in some cases, we do need to forgive ourselves, right? And we need to forgive people, and maybe not necessarily people involved, although I will say that is very beneficial to the healing process. If you can get to that point, you can find a way to do that. And you're going to really only be able to do that through understanding, right? And it's that understanding of like, well, why would someone do that? How did they end up like that? What does it take for a person to commit those kinds of acts? Like, again, let's reference the recent attacks in Israel. It's like, how could a human being go and just murder innocent people, innocent women and children, and butcher them like that? Like, think about how angry and cynical and resentful and nihilistic and just bitter and just warped their whole view of the world must be, and how they must feel about themselves and people and reality in order to commit those kinds of acts, right? And in order to enjoy committing those kinds of acts. And so it's like, through understanding, you'll come to forgiveness. And that's been a pattern that I've consistently seen in my own journey, repeated over and over again. And so it's about understanding the patterns involved, and that's something that we do. If you watch the video I did on 4 ways to process traumatic memories, one of the ways is identifying the patterns involved. So going in and understanding who did what and why, right? And that's going to help with that understanding that's going to lead to forgiveness. So working on your traumatic memories, processing your traumatic memories is part of healing moral injury. They're very closely related. And I also talk with moral injury, or with monuments, I call them monuments of misery, unprocessed traumatic memories. That's the term that I use. And there's a reason for that, and I explain it in other videos. But it's like, I talk about how if you have unprocessed traumatic memories, there's going to be a lot of like negative emotion associated with them, right? But now I'm also saying that there's this moral injury over here, and there's all this negative emotion that's kind of associated with that. And so like, well, is it both? Or are they the same like reservoir of negative emotion? It's just from different angles. And it's like, yes, it's both, in the sense of like, there's going to be some anger and resentment and rage. Well, rage and anger is the same thing, whatever, that you feel about the specific incident involved, but you also might have some towards society. Like, I know I used to feel very resentful and bitter towards society for being so indifferent as to allow certain things to occur. You know, like some of the things that happened to me as a child, I blamed society for those things occurring. And I have, you know, I have other friends who feel the same, who feel the same way, though maybe they might not consciously say it. Like, it's obvious that they hold society to account to some degree for the things that happen to them, especially when they were children. And so fixing all of this is a lot more complicated than just, you know, quote unquote, healing a relationship, because what you're dealing with your very most core beliefs. And so the way that you came to conceptualize the world is so foundational and so fundamental that making those shifts requires a tremendous amount of effort. And I'll just say that I could not have done it without psychedelics. Now, I came to this understanding of all of this through psychedelics. And so it's possible that somebody could do it now that I'm explaining it, now that I went and kind of like figured out ways to conceptualize it. Maybe people can now do it without psychedelics. But I think to the degree that someone's suffering from moral injury, the more severe it is, the more likely it is they're going to need to involve psychedelics in the healing process. And I'm not advocating that you go and do psychedelics, because they're not for everyone and not everyone's ready. There's a certain amount of preparation that goes into it, and that can take sometimes a year or two, because you really have to psychologically develop yourself. And I'm going to make a separate video about psychedelics. It's actually going to be going up shortly after this one, and I'll dive deeper into that. But hopefully this video has been useful. Hopefully you're starting to kind of understand what moral injury is, and hopefully conceptualizing its 3 relationships that have been damaged that we need to heal makes sense. In the next video, I'm going to dive deeper into the healing process and how we go in and reprogram those core beliefs. So hopefully you're finding all these videos useful and interesting. If you haven't already, subscribe. That helps me with growing the channel. And if you could share this on social media or like on Reddit or Facebook group or whatever, that definitely helps me spread the word. Thanks for watching.